I recently read the novelization of The Chosen Season 1, and it's got some stuff in it that isn't in the TV show, so let's talk about it. Alright, so today we're going to be talking about Season 1, Episode 1 of The Chosen, I Have Called You by Name. And the first person that I want to talk about that the novelization gives some insight about is NICODEMUS. One of the main things that we learn about NICODEMUS in the novelization is how introspective he is. This isn't all too surprising given how he's portrayed in the show, but the benefit of reading a novel is that we get some insight into precisely what he's thinking at certain key moments in the show. For instance, whenever we meet him for the very first time in the show, we see him praying as he travels by carriage towards Capernaum. The novel tells us what precisely he was praying about. Weary of the various trappings of his station as a teacher of teachers, he is silently seeking forgiveness for the times he has reveled in the adulation of younger clerics and deference from the public. In fact, he's even cognizant of the fact that this annual trip to Capernaum has been a frequent stumbling block to his humility, inflating his ego and causing him to think more highly of himself than he knows he ought. He longs to be as devout as the younger version of himself, but it becomes tougher with each passing day. Later on, while talking with the Capernaum Pharisees about the Messiah, NICODEMUS reflects on his ability to speak while pondering other things at the same time, his mind flitting away to fantasies of the most thrilling of all prophecies, the messianic ones, even as he continues to teach the others. And so we really get insight to how introspective NICODEMUS is throughout the playing out of this episode. The second thing we learn about NICODEMUS is that his voyage into Lilith's living quarters marked his first ever time attempting to exorcise a demon. While he had witnessed an exorcism a few years prior and had been taught the particulars of how to do it, he had never been confronted by such a situation personally and had silently hoped to never have to. After his failure in the Red Quarter, we see NICODEMUS' introspection return to the forefront again, with his insecurity arising as he notes that the students see him in a new light, no longer leaning forward, eager for his wisdom, which definitely serves as a foil to the pride that he was experiencing earlier on in the episode. Another thing that we learn about NICODEMUS from this section of this episode of the book is that we learn a little bit about his relationship with his wife, ZOHARA. Whenever he voices his concern that perhaps there's more to learn about Adonai and the law than at first seemed possible, her rebuke actually wounds him, showing how much he respects her opinion and cares for her approval. At the same time, even this has its limits, because when she proceeds to tell him that he will never utter that thought in public, he's annoyed, his inner dialogue insisting that she has gone too far. However, just a short while later, the advice she gives to him leaves him reflecting on her wisdom, which he holds as the reason that he married her so long ago. Moving on from NICODEMUS, however, I do want to talk a little bit about Simon. Simon is probably the one that we learned the least about in this first episode, but we're going to learn more about him as we go into the episodes going forward. One thing that we do learn about Simon is that Simon and Andrew's father, Jonah, has passed away prior to the beginning of the show. While it's heavily hinted at in the show itself, here it gets explicit mention. We don't learn anything of their mother, but the novel does tell us that the two brothers had been inseparable since early childhood, having apprenticed as fishermen under their father and lived at the Sea of Galilee all their lives. Moving on from Simon, let's talk a little bit about Andrew. We learn a little bit more about Andrew's relationship with John the Baptizer in the novelization, though not much more than is provided in the episode itself. As Simon and Andrew sit on the banks of the Sea of Galilee and ponder their circumstances shortly after Simon's fight, the novel tells us that Andrew had become enamored with a crazy preacher in the wilderness who rants about the coming Messiah. Such information is made clear throughout the progression of the show, but the novel helps the audience better understand Simon's perspective on Andrew's recent obsession, which he definitely views it as just that, an obsession. He considers the baptizer to be a laughingstock, dressed in animal skins and subsisting on locusts and honey. Next up, let's talk a little bit about Matthew. One of the first things that we learn about Matthew is that he's in his late 20s at the start of the show, which actually makes him one of the younger ones, given some details that we'll talk about in a little bit. We also get further insight to precisely where Matthew falls on the autism spectrum, an artistic embellishment added by the creators of the show, which has made Matthew one of the most talked about and most endearing characters of the show. While the novel doesn't use such terms precisely, it does allow us to step inside Matthew's mind so that we can see a little bit about how his mind works. For instance, when he's picking out his clothes in the morning, we learn that he knows exactly which garment he will select, but he also feels compelled to perform the seemingly endless routine of rifling through his clothes every single day. At the same time, we learn that no one else he knows suffers from this, leaving him feeling even more alone than his position as a tax collector already makes him. Now, moving on from Matthew, we're actually going to turn our attention towards Mary Magdalene, who is definitely, without a doubt, the person that we learn the most about in this episode, and fittingly so. But I do want to share one little detail that I found very fun, which fans had kind of speculated about, but is confirmed in the novelization. The tavern often frequented by characters in the show is called the Hammer, which many fans speculated was a reference to Judas Maccabee, a Jewish celebrity from the 2nd century BC who was famously nicknamed the Hammer. Sure enough, the novel does confirm this. The Hammer was named for Judas the Hammer Maccabeus, a legendary zealot who led a famous revolt known as the Maccabean Revolt, which NICODEMUS does talk about later on in the show. Okay, but let's turn our attention to Mary Magdalene. Like I said, she is the one we learn the most about in this novelization, in this episode, and she's also at the forefront of episode 1 of The Chosen, so it makes sense that we would learn the most about her. First and foremost, the thing that the book wants to make absolutely clear is that Mary was not a prostitute. The creators of the show have clarified this time and time again in their Q&As and live streams, but if somebody sits down to watch the show by itself, they might be left with the strong impression that Mary, inhabiting the Red Quarter, was a prostitute when we're introduced to her in episode 1. Given that this tradition isn't uncommon throughout church history, because sometimes people conflate Mary Magdalene with another person mentioned in the Gospels, as well as the fact that one of our first scenes with her involves a man rushing away from her living quarters, it's understandable why some people would come to this conclusion. However, the book makes it clear on multiple occasions that Mary has never been a woman of the night, though she is aware that some people might mistake her as such due to her dwelling in the Red Quarter, a place which is, admittedly, a common home for prostitutes. In fact, the reason she lives in the Red Quarter to begin with is simply because that's the only place where she can live, as we'll talk about in a little bit. She makes most of her money from begging and scrounging, and she's permitted to dwell in her quarters at Rivka's inn in exchange for doing Rivka's hair. Another thing that we learn about Mary from the novelization is that Mary is 33 years old at the beginning of the show. Depending on what version of the show that you're watching, the chronology of events can be a bit tricky when you're watching The Chosen, because sometimes the dates keep changing back and forth depending on if you're watching it on DVD, on the app, stuff like that. Well, the book serves to clarify a lot of that, and it tells us that the flashback scene featuring Mary and her father at the beginning of the episode takes place 2 years after the events of The Shepherd, which details the birth of Jesus. The book also tells us that Mary is 5 years old in this scene, making her 3 years older than Jesus, and that the main timeline of the show takes place 28 years old after the events of the flashback. When you put all this together, this makes Mary 33 at the start of the show, while Jesus is 30, and like we mentioned earlier, we know that Matthew is in his late 20s. So Matthew's the youngest, Jesus is going to be right in the middle, and Mary is 33, and we really don't know how old a lot of the other people are, at least so far. Next up, speaking of the flashback scene, the book reveals to us that the name of Mary's father is Anuk. While Anuk isn't a biblical character, his name is actually a Hebrew name meaning gracious or merciful, but historically speaking, it is typically a name given to girls, not guys. However, the number one takeaway from the novelization of the first episode is Mary's backstory. More than anything else in episode 1, the novelization serves the purpose of filling in a lot of her backstory, which is absent or merely hinted at in the show. We learn that her family belonged to a group of Bedouins, but that shortly after her father's death, her mother lost the land, resulting in the two of them making the 7-mile trudge from Magdala to Capernaum. When they arrived, Mary and her mother were assigned a tiny servant's hovel, and they made a meager living by doing housekeeping work in the wealthy district. However, assuming Anuk's responsibilities and attempting to take care of both herself and Mary resulted in Mary's mother growing sick, and by the time Mary was a teenager, her mother was decrepit and unable to work. Mary took over the responsibilities of the household, but she understandably made less money working by herself than the two of them made working together. As she grew older, she began to notice that men were looking at her differently, and in time she eventually caught one particular Roman soldier leering at her. This eventually led to the tragic moment alluded to briefly in the episode and featured in just very fleeting flashbacks, but which is stuck with Mary going forward. On one day, while she was in the market, that same Roman yanked her into a small room off the alley, and she couldn't escape his advances anymore. He had his way with her, and she was left traumatized by the experience, and perhaps most tragically of all, she never told anyone about it, not even her mother, who died just a few months later. Mary avoided the marketplace going forward, which resulted in her being fired from her job. Any dream she had ever had to one day marry and have a family vanished before her eyes. And with her prospects so low, she eventually found her way to the Red Quarter and Rivka's Inn. She introduced herself as Lilith, seeking to leave her past behind her, and was granted lodging in Rivka's Inn in exchange for doing women's hair. In time, she knew that the public lumped her together with all the others dwelling in the Red Quarter, but fortunately for her, she had endeared herself to the women in the inn before they bore witness to her first spell, which is her way of referencing and understanding what we know to be demonic attacks. But speaking of Mary's spells, we also learn a little bit about what it's like when Mary experiences one of her episodes. She often remembers only temporary portions of what happens when she's overcome by the demons, and in the resulting chaos, she's often left confused and with no memory of what caused it to begin with. She isn't entirely aware of what it is that's going on. She merely feels overtaken, and she doesn't know whether it's demonic oppression or if she's just going insane. She likewise doesn't know when the episodes truly began, but she speculates that it could have been when she cursed God upon her father's death, or when her mother's health had so deteriorated that she had to become like the parent, or perhaps whenever she was violated by the Roman. Another benefit to the novelization is that we also get insight into what's going on in Mary's mind, which we've already talked about a little bit, but one thing that I thought was really cool in particular is that stepping inside Mary's mind also gives us insight to the significance of the cliff that she wanders to near the end of the episode as she prepares to take her own life. She had summited the cliff upon first arriving to Capernaum years before when she was just a child, having heard of the spectacular view the cliff had to offer of the Sea of Galilee. Now, however, what beckons her to the cliff is not the view of the sea, but the jagged rocks below. It's actually a really dark moment when you're reading the novel. Where she had once been careful to stay at least 15 feet from the edge, now she strides right to the edge, praying that a gust of wind will do the job for her and deliver her from her misery. It is in this moment, however, when Mary's at her lowest moment, that Mary sees the dove, and the novel gives us a little bit more insight into what's going on in her mind when she sees this dove. As she contemplates jumping off from the cliff, the dove flies overhead, and something, she knows not what, compels her to follow it with her eyes. And shortly thereafter, she finds herself wandering from the cliff and back into the city. She finds herself disgusted with her failure to follow through with her initial plans and is determined to return to the cliff, but instead she finds herself following the dove. Or perhaps it is something else that leads her, until she arrives at the hammer once again for a fateful moment that will change her entire future. It is in the hammer where Mary encounters Jesus. As soon as he touches her hand, she finds herself pondering what or who inside her is so repulsed by him. And when he calls her by her name, she is taken aback because not a soul in Capernaum knows her real name. Remember, she had introduced herself as Lilith, not as Mary. She had never told anybody that her name was actually Mary. She had tried to start a new life when she came to Capernaum, but this guy knows who she is. And as he begins to quote those familiar scriptures to her, she feels a spell coming on as everything in her opposes this man, the demons begging to take her over once again. But when he says those powerful words, "I have redeemed you," she can't help but notice the significance of the claim. Despite the demonic attack overtaking her, she can't help but marvel at the fact that the man in front of her is claiming to be the one who created her, which even the demon-influenced Mary recognizes to be blasphemy if it isn't true. But then he leans in, draws her to his chest, and mutters the words, "Be gone." And whatever has tormented her for so long gushes from her, leaving her empty and spent and free from pain. She is redeemed. And there's the insights that the novelization had to give us from Season 1, Episode 1. If there's anything there that surprised you, be sure to let me know in the comments. And if you've read the novelization and if there was anything else that I missed, be sure to leave that down there below because I like having conversations about this. Other than that, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, share this with your family, friends, strangers, everybody, and I will see you next time. Be sure to keep a smile on your face and don't let anybody steal your joy. God bless.
You read a verse, you sing a hymn, the money's in the plate. Sundays you mark out for him, but even then you show up late. You bought the shirt, you wear the cross, but sin throughout the week. For 30 shekels and a noose, you kiss him on the cheek.